All right, folks, so these are the next generation Garmin Rally Power Meter pedals, and it's actually been over 4 years since Garmin released their original Rallies, and these have some pretty substantial updates all around, like they're now more durable, it's now much easier to swap pedal bodies, there's even more cycling dynamics that we can geek over, and they finally ditched the coin cell batteries from before, and these are now rechargeable. And these new Rallies aren't the only thing that Garmin's announcing today, so they finally dropped their new Edge 850 and 550 bike computers, which bring all the functionality and features of both their Edge 1050 as well as their new Edge MTB into these new computers. And I've got another video going over all the details of these, which I'll have linked down in the description below. So just like the previous generation Rallies, so these come in a few different flavors. So you have your road options with both a Look Keo cleat, so that's the Rally RK. Then you have your Shimano SPD SL version, so that's the Rally RS. And then you also have the mountain version right here with the Rally XCs. And then with any of these options, you can choose between single-sided or dual-sided power. So the single-sided versions are what they call the Rally 110s, and the dual-sided versions are what they call the Rally 210s. And the ones I have for you today are the dual-sided versions of both the Rally RS for SPD SL and then the Rally XCs for mountain. And I've had a handful of rides on these so far, so I do have some data to show you in this video, but it wouldn't be fair to call this an in-depth review by any means either. So this is more of a first look video to let you all know about the new features, and then I'll have a more in-depth follow-up video a little bit later on down the road with some longer term thoughts about both accuracy as well as durability. So make sure to subscribe to get a notification when that video comes out. All right, so next up, let's talk about price and options. So with the road version, so these start at $749 for the single-sided versions of either the SPD SL or the Look Keo versions, and then $1199 for the dual-sided options. And then with the SPD Rally XC, so these run $799 for the single-sided versions and then $1299 for the dual-sided options. Now, just like before, you can swap pedal bodies if you'd like with these new versions, but they've drastically improved the process to do this, and it's now something that you actually may want to do versus before. It was kind of like just enough hassle not to be all that great of an option. Anyhow, we'll get to that process here in just one bit, but being that you actually can switch these bodies out pretty easily now, they're also offering bundles where you can get 2 different sets of bodies, so one for road and then one for mountain, and then one set of spindles. So you can swap from road to mountain without necessarily having to spend money on 2 completely different sets of pedals. And the price for the kits is the same whether you want SPD SL or Look Keo version, so they're all $1449, and then with any of those you'll obviously get the XCs in the kit. But being that these aren't cheap by any means, that bundle option actually can save you a bit of money if you're okay with switching pedal bodies out, but we'll talk more about that in here in just one bit. Now, in terms of the difference between the single-sided versions and the dual-sided versions, so first off, there's power, where with the single-sided version it'll collect power from the left-hand pedal but not the right, but with the dual-sided you'll get power independently from each pedal. However, since the dual-sided versions are able to collect power from both sides, you can also see additional cycling dynamics like left and right power balance, seated versus standing time, as well as a few other metrics we'll talk about here in just one bit. Okay, so for the changes with the hardware, so the new road versions now have a new body design where they've reduced weight all around just by having a more streamlined and more svelte pedal body, but they also claim that these should be more durable. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a one-to-one comparison to show you where my old Rallies were Look Keos and these new ones that I have are SPD SL, but just from the looks of it, they definitely have reduced a lot of the needed material. The bigger changes though are with the Rally XCs, where they completely redesigned these bodies with an all-metal build that adds durability, but they're also more low profile than before with both the stack height as well as the engagement, where these should be much less susceptible to damage since you have a bit more clearance. That was probably one of my biggest complaints with the original Rally XCs, is that those were tall pedals from a stack height perspective, and these are a definite improvement in that department. But you'll also notice that the engagement has been drastically reduced on the front and the back of the pedals, and this was definitely something that, well, stuck out to me on the originals and led to more pedal strike than what I would have liked, but they've definitely made those a lot more low profile than before. And then when it comes to Q factor, so that looks to be identical from the originals, and I also don't see any difference between the Rally XCs and the Rally RSs that I have, so those look to be all the same. And then for weight, so there's really no difference that I can tell from the original Rally XCs to these new versions, but the SPD SL versions look to be a handful of grams lighter than the originals. However, the engagement does seem to be slightly different to me than the originals, where these feel a little bit smoother, but this is something I'm going to have to follow up for you all in a longer term look. Oh, and then another thing is that the bearings feel like buttery smooth, by the way, and that actually may be a good segue to talk about these new spindles. And they've also redesigned the power sensing spindles themselves, where these are supposed to be more responsive to power changes than before, but the other change they made with these is that they've redesigned these in a way which makes the process for swapping pedal bodies out much easier, where you don't have to like mess around with all the battery compartment stuff and seals like the originals, where there's basically just 2 tools that you need and 2 things that you need to do. So for tools, all you need is a standard 15mm 5mm pedal wrench as well as a 5mm Allen wrench, but a torque wrench could also be good to have as well. So all you have to do to swap pedal bodies now is just remove the outer cap from the pedal body and then unscrew another nut that hides underneath. And then the spindle just comes out and then you can swap pedal bodies. But when you do go to reinstall the fixing nut though, so this is probably where it's best to have a torque wrench, as they do have a recommended spec for this. And then one more thing to note here is that the threads on these differ from left to right pedal, where the right pedal has opposite threads. So to loosen both the outer cap as well as the nut, you'll go clockwise, and to tighten, you'll go counterclockwise. And then with the left pedal, that's normal threads, where righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. And this is made, by the way, to prevent the nuts from unscrewing themselves with normal pedaling motion. So this process is definitely way easier than the originals. It's not like the originals were hard by any means, but it was just enough friction where it wasn't really all that convenient. But I'm sort of curious though, how many of you out there actually do this, whether that's on some original rallies or even like Fabero's latest pedals, where you can actually swap these pedal bodies out pretty easily. Like both the Faberos and these Garmin's are very easy to swap out, but is that something that you actually do? So I'm kind of curious about that, so let us all know down in the comments section down below. Now for battery life, so first off, these are now rechargeable versus the coin cell batteries that they've used on previous versions. Garmin pedals have definitely had a long history of battery drama, but they did finally solve that, at least with the last versions, but we still had to replace the batteries. These are now rechargeable with a little magnetic charger, which then plugs into an included USB-C cable, which are nice and long, by the way, so they can actually reach your pedals from your wall chargers, but do note that these don't come with a wall charger. And then they advertise that these should last up to 90 hours of ride time per charge, and if you are low on juice, there's now a quick charge feature where you can plug them in for around 15 minutes for up to 12 hours of ride time. And then while you're traveling, you can also put these into a travel mode from the app, where they'll go to sleep to save on battery life. But these do have both Bluetooth as well as ANT+ connectivity, but there's a little bit of a difference here that we'll talk about here in just one bit. Now, in terms of calibration for power accuracy, so they're actually rolling out a new Pedal IQ smart calibration system if you're pairing this over secure Bluetooth, where they're supposed to be able to alert you when the pedals need to be calibrated. So some possible criteria for this would, let's say, be changes in temperature, since that can play a role in accuracy, the time since the last time the pedals were calibrated, as well as possibly detecting if the pedals have been removed and installed on a new bike. And by the way, when you do set the pedals up via secure Bluetooth, you have the option for smart calibration reminders to get always reminded to calibrate on every ride, or you can just choose to do it manually. But once again, these new Pedal IQ smart calibration prompts are only available over the secure Bluetooth connection type with your compatible Garmin device and isn't available over ANT+. So from an accuracy department, so these have the same claim plus or minus 1% accuracy as before, but they claim that these are now going to be more responsive to changes in power. So basically more instantaneous feedback. And they've achieved this by redesigning their strain gauge as well as adding a gyroscope. Now, I've only had a few rides on these at this point, so I'm going to need more time to dig deeper into that responsiveness bit, but I do have to say that the accuracy is looking pretty good out of these so far. And I'm comparing these to both a Tacx Neo 3M, which is a very accurate trainer, as well as a pair of SRAM's latest force cranks. Now, SRAM's Quark power meters have always read a little bit high for me, and I'm talking about like nearly all of them that I have. So I'm not necessarily surprised to see the Quarks be higher in this case, but the power from the rallies does seem to line up with the 3M. And a few watts higher than the 3M as well, since we're talking about measuring power of the pedals versus the trainer, where there can be drivetrain loss. Oh, and by the way, these are also supposed to be compatible with oval chain rings, but unfortunately I don't have any bikes with oval chain rings to test that out. Now, when it comes to the data that these can collect beyond just power and cadence, so if you get the dual-sided 210s, you also get additional metrics like left and right power balance, seated versus standing time, pedal power phase in terms of what part of your pedal stroke you're generating the most power, as well as pedal platform offset, which is basically where on the pedal body you're applying the most pressure. But adding to that, with these new second generation rallies, these also can now collect cycling force. And the question may be, how is cycling force different than cycling power? So power is the combination of both the amount of pressure, or the actual force you're applying to the pedals, combined with cadence. So you can think of power as the output of both of those things together, but what they're now doing is delivering that force data independently. Okay, cool, but how do we actually use this? Well, this is apparently supposed to help us understand just how much force or pressure we have to apply to the pedals at varying cadence to generate similar amounts of power. We already know that to produce the same amount of power at different cadences puts different amounts of strain to our muscles. So in general, lower cadences have more muscular strain, and then higher cadence takes less force but may require more from our cardiovascular systems. So with force, I think the goal here is to isolate that particular metric so we may be able to better understand just how much force we need at particular cadences to produce the same amount of power. Now, in terms of the usefulness of all this data, so some of these can certainly come in handy, let's say from a fit standpoint, like let's say pedal platform offset. Definitely useful to help us adjust our cleats. And then power phase, possibly on the seat position side of things. And then with force, so I think that could be interesting as well to help us dial in a more optimal pedal stroke that works best for our riding style and fitness level. Are these actually needed? Well, no, not needed, but they could definitely be useful if you're trying to optimize every variable possible. Now, just like the Pedal IQ smart calibration system, cycling force is only going to be available on compatible Garmin bike computers, and again, over only secure Bluetooth. And I'll have a link down in the description below of the compatible devices that support these features, but you'll still get all the other metrics like pedal phase and left-right power balance over and plus. So they've definitely made some very welcome changes with these new rallies, but just like anything else these days, these also do get a bump in price and are also more expensive than Favero's latest pedals, which are also very accurate. They're also rechargeable, and you can also switch out the spindles. There's some nice additional features that you get with these, being that they're Garmin's and they have tighter integration with the Garmin ecosystem. So if you're in that ecosystem, that could be a reason to get these, but if you're not, those features really won't make any difference to you. Anyhow, I'll have some longer term thoughts on these a little bit later on down the road when I've had more time with them, and I'll also be comparing these with some other power meters on the market, so make sure to stay tuned for those videos and plenty of other videos that are right around the corner. Actually, in like an hour or so. In the meantime, happy riding, and we will see you in the next video.